What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Norman Wirzba. That's right, Norman, a dookie, a blue devil, and nonetheless, despite being employed at the worst school that plays basketball in the Atlantic Coast Conference, go Deeks, I love Norman Wirzba, and his new book is one of those that when I started reading it, I was like, oh, what is this Love's Braided dance? Like, how's this going to go? Where's this going to go? Where are you taking me, Norman? And it's hard for Norman to outdo previous Norman books, okay? Okay, you can just go listen to some of our previous conversations. I actually think his book on the phenomenology of prayer is one of the best prayer books I've ever read. I wouldn't hand it out to lay people, but I have like my own version of it, which he ended up talking about it, like my own version of like how I used it in a ministerial context. But this book is looking at hope. Love's Braided Dance is looking at hope at a time where an increasing number of people are hopeless. And we talk about the environmental crisis. We talk about the way in which our life and society are orienting us in ways that diminish the substance addictiveness of our relationships and the connections to others, our neighbors, and our world. And yeah, it was amazing. So look, I hope you enjoy this, but I just want you to know, Love's Braided Dance as a book is just beautiful and enjoyable to read. And so, you know, if you're sitting there and going like, I don't know what's my next nerdy book, check out Love's Braided Dance, because look, I'm a Norman Wirzba fan and it impressed me, right? Like, it was better than my expectations, which are already high for Norman because he's pretty awesome. But then it was like, this one's like, oh, it brings the nerdy boom shakalaka. I know it's an ontological category. I don't have time to explain it. You'll just have to experience it. All right, here's Norman. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Norman Wirzba, and he has a brand new book, Love's Braided Dance, which is looking at hope in a time of crisis. And, you know, Norman, I absolutely love this book. It was spectacular. It was kind of like, you know, in my like list of things I'd like to write about. I had got to scratch it off because you just did it. You know?
Oh, you're pretty kind, Trip. Thanks.
Well, I really enjoyed it. And I thought maybe the place to begin is for you to share a bit about the origin story of the book and your experiences with your adult kids and in the classroom there at Duke.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, working with younger people, and I mean, you know, 20-somethings, but also 30-somethings, I learned pretty quickly on that the term hope is viewed with considerable suspicion. In fact, I've heard people say, I don't even want to talk about hope. And, you know, that was a bit arresting to me to hear that a term that is one of these sort of elemental terms, right? I mean, hope is a pretty big word that means a lot of things. And, you know, we need I thought we needed to have it in our register of speaking and thinking and feeling. And so to hear younger people say, just not interested, that was quite something to take in. And there was also this reality that so many of the younger people that I was engaging with were telling me that either they themselves or people they knew were not going to have kids because the world is such a mess. And that's a pretty significant decision to make, and it reveals a lot about where we are in our time. And so I figured that for me, the word hope is important, but for others, it clearly isn't. And so I had to think carefully about, how do you approach a topic that's viewed with so much suspicion and even derision? And after that, if I'm going to talk about hope, how do I do it in a way that's really honest so that these younger people, upon hearing me talk about it, are not going to say, don't trust him, don't believe him, don't want to follow anything he's up to. So that was in my head a lot. And so that sort of became the basis for my desire to try to describe hope in terms that were fairly different, certainly from the ways I had been taught about that term, but also the way that many of these younger people were hearing that term being used in their own sort of context.
Yeah, and you know, last time you were on the podcast, we talked a bit about the way in which our modern world, the kind of scientific framing, the nature of consumerism, reliance on technology has generated kind of a series of alienations for the modern subject from so much of the world around us. And in this book, you also pick up on kind of how that's increasingly being intensified. And so I wonder how you see the kind of the modern subject and the way it exists in the world and the way its relationships are mediated as intensifying or kind of generating the context where the conversation of hope or the question of hope is something a growing number of people are allergic to.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of dimensions to your question, Trip, and I think a way to start is to ask about what kinds of relationships are people actually having or experiencing. And I talk in the book about social media platforms which promise connection of all kinds, many, many connections. And there's no doubt that these devices, like just a smartphone, or an iPad, these are wonderful inventions. They make a lot of things possible. But we also need to think about how these devices that promise so much are still leaving people pretty hollow. They're wondering about whether or not the connections that are being promised are really doing the thing that most matters. And that, I think, is not just to feel that you're stimulated, but that something deeper is happening, something like an inner transformation that is happening. And in this respect, the work of the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa has been so helpful to me, because he wrote this really fabulous book called Resonance, in which he argued that so much of what modern industrial, urban, now technological culture does is it dissipates the capacity for resonance. And what I mean by it in terms of, say, relationships, it's the feeling that you have, which is a physiological, emotional, but also, I think, cognitive transformation that happens when you come into a room and you meet the person who is your beloved, and your whole inner being is transformed by the encounter. Or when you are listening to a piece of music, and it's not just background music, but it's music that stirs you so that you either want to dance, or it stirs you so that you want to weep, or whatever, right? These are the kinds of things that alert us to the fact that something deep is happening, which is touching us at our most inner being. And, we can talk about that in different ways, I suppose, but it's the kind of response to a world which helps us know that we are not just on a world, but we're thoroughly entangled within a world that we perceive to be the kind of place and the kind of set of relationships that make our very being possible and potentially good. And that's something that I think a lot of folks are not experiencing when they're on TikTok or Twitter or whatever medium they happen to be on. There's a lot of stimulation, but it ain't doing the kind of thing that makes us feel more alive.
Yeah, I think you're right. And for listeners that may have missed it, they can go check out the interview with Rosa where he unpacks this. And one of the places that there's this resonant relationship between you two is where he talks about kind of the nature of acceleration, availability, these kinds of things, and describing how the modern subject is in this frenetic standstill where you have to accumulate and become more efficient and all these things just to hold your place in society, let alone kind of have any kind of advance and such. You have a riff around the nature of moreness in the book. I found really helpful that the modern subject has this drive, right, for having more, doing more, and being more. When you think of both that analysis and then the students at the divinity school and in the undergrad, and then the different departments that you're working with at Duke, thinking of how the university and the way it's forming people can address these kind of big challenges we face as a species. What are some examples that can kind of like help bring to mind people just how these demands for more in these three facets are really kind of the water we swim in?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's tough because a place like Duke is you don't go there if you don't want to, really optimize every opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. Which is precisely the thing that kills residents. And I think this is something that is really difficult to affect on a, so shall we say, institutional level. But when you can talk to people on a personal level, all kinds of things can happen. So, for instance, one of the things that I like to do with people is I like to say, think about just what a smartphone has enabled us to do in our world today, right? We can scroll through a web that will make available to us every product you can imagine. It can open up any location in the world to us. It can put us in touch with any person around the world who has a similar device, right? There's so many ways that the world has been opened up, and it's made the commodification and the consumption of the world something that people 100 years ago could never have imagined, right? And the question is, we have all of this, and we want more, and we have to think from it, what is going on here? And I think it's an inability to think carefully and rigorously and communally about this thing called enough, right? What is enough? But the second question that has to go with that is, what's the point? What's it all for? So if you think that we have more than we've ever had before, and we're still not happy, why aren't we happy? Is it that the things are not satisfying us? Maybe. I mean, I think some of the things I have, they are deeply satisfying. So I don't want to knock things. They're good to have and be with. But I think there's something deeper going on here, which is not just about accumulation, but about the quality of the relationships we have with the things, the people, the places that we are in. And it's that quality question, I think, that gets erased in so much. It's not just about accumulation then, but about relationships that are deeply satisfying because, again, they have this potential to make us feel more alive. And this is something that I think a lot of people have a desire to explore and experience. And, I think the most troubling right now is to see how universities are really going after AI because they're working on the assumption more information, more data, better computational power, faster computational power will solve our problems. And I don't doubt that AI can do some really good things, but the premise tells us that it's rubbish to think that just getting more data and more computational power will do us a lot of good because we're seeing how it's already doing a lot of damage.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if you see a connection in the kind of infatuation with AI is akin or maybe related to the same thing about STEM or the empirical sciences, which in many ways tempts us to render thin the parts of the world that don't match that domain of inquiry, right? So the data sets of AI we might experience them in some kind of magical other, but behind it, is a collection of content generated by humans. And in a similar way, from the birth of kind of empirical investigation of the world, yes, that has given us all sorts of power to understand and comprehend the world. But its detriment is the elements of reality not engaged in that form. Where the qualitative part of existence that you don't get at through kind of a quantitative or empirical investigation gets muted, or we become numb to it. And it seems to me the way you're even describing what AI can do, both in its research function and in the way it algorithmically mediates so many of our relationships and social media platforms and such, is doing something similar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in what you just said, Tripp. And I think, yes, on the one hand, we have to talk very, very clearly and carefully about what we mean by information, what we mean by data, what is it capturing and what is it not? Because, for instance, when I talk to some of my medical school friends, there's so much hope about what AI can do in the medical space with, not only diagnoses, but detection and so forth. It's pretty incredible what's possible there. But what is not included in that, of course, is the big question, right? What is lost when we're trying to, say, do something like a data double of a human organ? right? When you think about how organs are always functioning in terms of their interactions with other organisms or other organs, and the organs form a whole organism embedded within ecosystems that have histories and complexities, right? There's so much that is lost in that kind of an effort. And I think this also raises a big philosophical question, which is something that, we can see already in the earliest phases with Aristotle's attempt to give us categories for understanding, categories that allow us to classify the world in particular sorts of ways. And, throughout history, what that has done, which is really important, is it's given us a way to distinguish kinds of things in the world. But what if we have made a mistake in thinking that we believe that creatures are just particular discrete kinds of things? It fits really well within a highly individualized, atomistic kind of metaphysical picture of the world. But what if you and I are not discrete bits? That we are not self-secure, self-contained entities, but are in fact constantly undergoing development because of our entanglements with other kinds of creatures, other beings, so that the only way you can really make sense of who we are is in terms of a story that has many actors, many places, right? So to understand me, if you just take a snapshot of me, which is what, a categorization of me would do, you just have eliminated that whole narrative dimension to who we are. So I'm not opposed to, empirical investigation of things, not at all. But I'm wanting to also say that when we think about the kinds of realities we want to best understand, we shouldn't do the big mistake, which is to isolate or extract or abstract things from their living contexts that really make them what they are. And I worry that what so much of our obsession with data is doing is it's not just keeping us at the level of what we in philosophy call information. It's not yet even knowledge, let alone wisdom, which is, I think, the thing that we are in most desperate need of right now, right? Wisdom to know how to be in the world, because for all the power that we have, we're clearly not doing the best job.
Yeah, I feel like there's like one of the temptations of just the speed and power and success of kind of the larger technological regime is it ends up generating for the individual and for collectives a deep desire for control. And this is something you talk about in the book, a kind of passivity before uncontrollable threats, where the notion of hope goes from, can I control and manage it? And then the moment you as the sole individual can't, then it generates this kind of anxious passivity before that which you can't control. And one of the things that you bring to the fore, both here, you do it in your phenomenology on prayer and also in your ecological work, is just kind of continuously reminding us, like, no, modernity is kind of the experiment that thinks controlling the uncontrollable is its vocation, right? Like that's not how we solve the existential questions of life. Yet we've kind of like got a kind of rigor mortis has set in for how we engage the world outside of it.
Yeah, Tripp, you can preach that, man. But you're right. I mean, I think one of the easiest ways to demonstrate how the dream of control is highly objectionable is to imagine someone coming to you saying, hey, I want to be in relationship with you. I want to get to know you. I want to be your companion. But for me to do that, I have to control you. Right? As soon as you were to hear that, you'd say, sorry, this is not going to happen, because a relationship that is founded upon control is a relationship which you know is not going to respect the integrity of what you control. Because to control another is you have to sort of reduce them to the frame of your management, the frame of your expectations, the frame of your desires. And that means the integrity of the other, allowing them to be who they are in all their distinct characteristics, is just gone. And you might say, okay, well, that works in the personal realm, but what about the world of other creatures or plants, or the world of places where we're not talking about human beings? Well, I would argue that here too we need to have a little bit more patience when we think about the kind of world we're in is it a personal world or not, right? The world of objectification, right, is obviously a world that is deeply impersonal, profoundly impersonal. But I would argue that the world is much more personal than it is impersonal. And this is, I think, where the sort of resurgence within philosophical circles, and environmental humanities, for instance, around recovering the sense of an animist world becomes so important, because what we know from all sorts of traditional pre-industrial communities, but also indigenous communities, is that they inhabited an animist metaphysic. And by that, they didn't mean everything is human, but they certainly understood that the creatures of this world and the places of this world were part of a moral community before which they had obligations and responsibilities.
Yeah. You mention in the book how the kind of colonialist mindset misunderstood or kind of didn't acknowledge the vitality and vitalism of, the scare quotes, New World upon arrival, but kind of like looking at that kind of particular moment in the past is revelatory of some of the challenges we face now.
Oh yeah, I mean it's so revelatory, because this sort of imperialist mindset which came to the places of discovery, so to speak, they came with the intention not of knowing them or understanding them or learning to live with them. They came with the understanding that the point of being there is to own, and then to extract, and then eventually to abandon the places in which you are. And, I reference Robin Kimmerer at that point, where, she talks about how one of the most important features about being in a place is that we can come to an appreciation of how that place nurtures us, how it is the very ground, literally, of our livelihood. And she says, when you come to a place without the desire to understand how that place is the source of your nurture and livelihood, you end up inhabiting places where, because they have now been presumed not to matter, they also eventually have this effect in which you residing upon those places can't really matter either. And she says this creates a kind of psychic disturbance in people where you don't feel how the land loves you. And we know what it's like to grow up in a household where you don't ever feel that you are loved. You're going to develop all kinds of compensatory strategies to determine, to show forth that you matter, that you have worth. And you can argue that we're seeing this in spades right now in the American political scene, where we got these people who are our leaders, ostensibly, who are obsessed with ego affirmation and can't understand the desire for us to want to love another, to be loved by another. We can only succeed by exercising our power over others who are presumed not to matter in and of themselves, right? So we're talking about a kind of breakdown of the most basic relationship that we need to have, which is this relationship with the earth as the place of our sustenance, the source of our inspiration, and the source of our good. And we don't have that, we're in big trouble.
Yeah, do you see that kind of or a thick account of belonging and the whole community of life that sustains you? It seems to me that part of what's happened in modernity, and something that's being intensified technologically, is the desire. I think the language used in the book is a frictionless world. Some of that shows up right with the incentive structure of the growing number of our relationships that are mediated by artificial intelligence and those algorithms of showing you experiences, encounter, and articulation of your own silo. So the other only shows up when it's an occasion of derision and self-legitimation. And then there's the alienation you've talked about, simply like in eating food, right? There's this whole web of life that we've commodified and then don't even reflect on the way we're grounded in the world. And you picked up a number of series of features there, but I wonder if you might want to unpack that and talk about how this has generated modern subjects that lack the kind of resilience necessary for communities that enable belonging, cooperation, and the very kind of, the fertile ground for hope being something,
Right.
That's not like laughable and dismissible.
Yeah, right, yeah. So, the desire for a friction-free life is really powerful. It's exemplified throughout all of the technological devices that get promoted to us, right? We're going to make life really easy for you. And here, too, you can sense that there's something off with that promise the minute you come to another person. I said, if I came to you and said, I want to control you, will you be my friend? You'll say, absolutely not. But imagine if I came to you and said, hey, I want to be your friend, but only if you're easy. The minute you cause me trouble, hey, I'm out the door, right? Again, you'd say, wait a minute, that's not friendship, right? Real friendship develops and becomes strong and important precisely because you don't necessarily want a lot of friction, but when it comes, the love is what keeps you in the relationship to work through with the friction, because the friction will teach you something. Right? The friction will teach you about your own vulnerabilities, your own hubris, or whatever. I mean, there's just so many things that happen when a relationship gets into trouble that is revelatory about each other. And we have to deal with this because it's an honest estimation of who we are as finite, fallible creatures. And so when we don't accept that we have to work through the friction with the friction, we assume that we should be living in a world that is only easy, that is only going to be acceptable if it's on our terms. Now that's just keeping it at the personal level, right? Imagine when we expand it out into our engagement with a world that is very complex, right? The diversity of creatures that we need to understand to work with them, plant, animal, insect, and so forth. If we think we're going to understand the world only in terms of its simplicity, only in terms of its ease, or only in terms that are amenable to our expectations for what the world should be like, we're going to do tremendous damage to the world, because we're not going to accept when it causes us to wonder, I think I misunderstood who I'm with, what I'm with, where I am. I now need to adjust. I need to correct so that I can be more, faithful to the honesty that is required when we're engaging a world that is mysterious and complex, often recalcitrant, often dangerous, right? But a world that is not always suited to our own liking. If we only want to have relationships that confirm what we like, we're in big trouble, because we lose the world and we lose the possibility of deep and meaningful relationships. And we end up, therefore, being fundamentally alone. Because if I object to being with people who are difficult, they're going to object to being with me, because I know I can be difficult.
Yeah, and that kind of erosion of genuine community, both in kind of interpersonal relations and kind of the larger kind of modern alienation from nature, you talk about how that sets up the category of hope to often be appropriated by forms of false hope, the big man solutions, whether it's kind of technological or individual or theological.
Right.
Can you kind of talk about the way in which the concept of hope kind of has to be reworked rather extensively in order for at least hope in the theological tradition we're inheriting to even be articulated in a modern framework?
Yeah, so I think one way to get at this is to make a very clear distinction between hope and optimism, right? I think a lot of people confuse those two or think that they're basically similes, and I think that's not exactly right, because optimism is a status quo concept. It says or presupposes that, no matter what, things are going to be okay. Just hang on, right? And that means that the way things now are, they might have some rough spots along the way, but if you hang on, it's all going to be all right. And I think that's simply false, because we know that the systems we're in are doing tremendous amounts of damage. It's also dangerous, because what optimism then does to us is it says the system is okay. You don't have to object to it. You don't have to criticize it. You don't have to work to transform it to make it a better place. And that too, it lines up pretty nicely with the world is acceptable on the terms that we have chosen, which we've just been talking about. Hope is vastly different than that, because hope does not assume that the status quo is all right. In fact, hope will be the voice that protests in the midst of the injustices that are causing so much hopelessness in the first place. Right? Hope becomes this animating power that catapults us into a future where we understand that it is our commitment to love others in the midst of all the struggle, in the midst of all the pain, and that in that commitment to love another, to love a community, to love a place, you actually create conditions in which other people can now want to come alongside you and say, I want to be a part of that effort that builds a healthier world, a more nutritious world, more equitable relationships, more peaceful relationships, right? Those are the kinds of things that inspire us. But optimism has nothing to say about, hey, things are not going so well right now. What are we going to do to change it? The optimist says, hey, don't worry, it's going to be okay, which is a sellout, basically. And that's exactly, of course, what you could say the man or the boss or whatever, they want you to remain passive and trust them. And this is something that I learned early on too from younger people. They are so tired of the man saying, trust us, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, you use the phrase of it turns us into the ultimate bystanders.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the real dangerous thing. And I would say that this ultimate bystander effect has its theological corollary too, right? On the one hand, you could say, if we subscribe to the view that some great person, Elon Musk, for instance, is going to save us, then we just say we'll wait for that technological device to come along, or if it's going to be some new energy source, right? So we will be able to do everything we've always been doing because now we've got energy that's too cheap to monitor. It's going to be so great. Right? That just takes us out of the equation because we just stay on as passive consumers who just wait. But think about how there's a theological corollary to this, which is, hey, folks, don't worry. God's got this. God is in control. And I think here we have to be very careful too, because the assumption that is at work when you say God's got this is that God is somehow a coercive monarch who's like a puppeteer who controls the strings. And, if you just trust God, it's going to be okay in the end. And I think that's super dangerous. And, we can talk more about this if you want to, but I think it's a real mischaracterization of what we understand God's power to be. Because the power of God is not the kind of coercive power that's just going to come in there and fix it for us because we are either belligerent or stupid or arrogant or fearful or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. I think that, that's why I was so taken back by the leader of the Democratic Party saying, like, well, the Lord's still on the throne,
Yes.
When looking at the feeling, this deep feeling of being overwhelmed with the election results, and I'm like, no, and even the pushback, seeing across the country is like, no, I don't. Please don't tell us our answer is to be a bystander till the train wreck's so big that we're given another turn at leadership. It's a
right.
But that in lieu of the technological big other, which was assigned to their party, let's just reclaim the religious big other as our anchor of passivity or the simulation of hope.
Yeah, it's such a discouraging thing to see, and it's, I think, a reflection too about how so much of the Christianity in America is deeply Gnostic. Because it does assume that what matters is your soul, not your body. And because your body doesn't matter, we don't have to pay attention to economic forms, political structures, ecological realities, because those would be the realities that impinge upon bodies directly and daily. But if you're just worried about the soul, right? The soul, that's ethereal. It's going to take care of itself after we die. It's all going to be great. And of course, that too results in a deeply anemic faith, right? Faith is something that you feel. It's not something that you actually do. And so you find in a lot of congregations this praising that happens in the midst of utter horror that's happening in the world. And if you try to bring that up, you say, well, that's a worldly concern. And what I want to say is, but don't you understand that at the heart of the Christian faith is the incarnation of God in the body of Jesus Christ that is then made manifest in all of these embodied ministries of feeding and healing and touching and exercising, and that this is the kind of ministry that throws a direct challenge to prevailing economic political structures. Right? We see this in the Gospels all over the place. And so it's really a walking away from what I think is absolutely core to Christianity, which again is not about us getting an escape from this world. It's about a transformation of this world. And to do that, right, to be committed to that kind of work is to be participating in the work that God has been doing all along. And so I want to say, absolutely, we can say that our hope is in God, but our hope is not in a God who's just sort of waiting in the wings to pluck our souls out after we die. The hope that we have in God is the hope that we have in this divine power that works to bring peace, that works to activate love in all the places of our life, that works to bring about the kinds of justice that honors the integrity and the beauty and the sanctity of this life.
Yeah, when you're developing the theological concept of hope, you kind of emphasize that hope is active, it's present-oriented, it's a kind of engagement and embrace of responsibility. When I'm interested in how, when introducing this kind of alternative account of hope to a kind of passivity of optimism or hopelessness, how do you introduce the Christian vision of hope to those that may think they're familiar with it and don't get it, or students that are like, oh my, I'm rolling my eyes, he's about to be too theological for a minute, I'll check back in later.
Yeah. You'll have noticed that there isn't a whole lot of theology that's happening explicitly in the book. And that was partly, it was on purpose. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I wanted to not set up frames of speaking that are going to automatically alienate people. Right? For a lot of people, the minute you use the word God, you've lost them because there's so much baggage that they might have with a term like that. And I totally get it. So for me, it was much more important to talk about, well, what is the Christian way as it's worked out in the lives of people and communities and places? And so speaking specifically about the way that is Christian life becomes much, much more important in a project like this than to give some sort of theological framework that you can slot whatever you're thinking about hope happens to be. I think the book does, in some respects, assume a theological, metaphysical picture, a grammar even. But I could do a lot of the work that you could say is clearly Christian in its orientation without having to use all that language. And for me, one of the ways to sort of hit that point was to say, let's not talk about hope as a noun, but let's talk about hope as a verb, because I think that's what needs to be done when we talk about other big Christian terms, right? That love is a verb. It's not simply a noun, or that faith is a verb and not simply a noun. And this becomes really, really crucial because sometimes people say, have you got faith? And if you got faith, you got your ticket to heaven. Or people say, if you got hope, right? It's like that vaccine or that security blanket that's going to protect you from stuff that's bad. And both of those are just massive errors, right? Because you don't have faith like a possession. You don't have hope like a possession. What you have is you participate in a way of being that is hopeful. You participate in a way of being that is faithful, right? That becomes the much, much more important thing. And when you're trying to address a population of people who have become deeply suspicious of God talk, I think it's much, much more important than to really hit on the difference it makes to inhabit and work out a hopeful, faithful, loving way of being in the world.
In one sense, your book is an apologetics of hope without like the confessional kind of a priori existing in it. But if you structured in a sense, the phenomenology of hope described there, and then your work on the phenomenology of prayer earlier, which is one of my favorite books about prayer. So if people haven't read it, they should just go read it. They're extremely parallel, right? So when you talk about prayer, there's you want to get past a prayer as some kind of use of linguistic objects and this kind of thing, and that it's an orientation, a way of thinking about attention and responsibility in the practical life, a way of being in the world, and I wonder if this kind of participatory, both and narrative driven and active and present oriented hope, what do you see that they're kind of that deep resonance between your like vision of prayer earlier?
I mean, I think so. And kudos to you for even knowing about that earlier stuff. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, because for me, one of the most important things about a prayerful way of being is that it's a way of being attentive to ourselves, to our world, to the people we are with, all in terms of our awareness of God's presence in it. Okay, so this is a kind of reorientation from prayer as something that we do as to gain favor or to make requests known. And, those things, I'm not saying they're completely illegitimate. But what we're talking about when we're talking about a prayerful life is a habitual way of being in the world, so that now everything we encounter in a new way. So that when I meet you, Trip, I don't just meet a competitor, I don't just meet an enemy, but I meet a child of God. Because to be in prayerful relationship with you and the world means I now see everything, I welcome everything, I perceive everything in terms of its being given to us by God as the expression of God's love in the world. Now, that's major transformation of all of our perceptual faculties, but it's also a major reorientation in terms of how do we respond to the recognition that the world we are in is not only deserving of our love, but is absolutely the place, the embodied location where this divine love is always already present and at work. Right? That's a game changer when you come to that realization. And I think it's also, a profound stimulus for us wanting to engage that world in ways, modalities of healing, nurture, reconciliation, all of which put us on the path to a hopeful future. Right? Because I make the point in the book that imagine if we lived in a world where every child knew that the adults around them, the institutions that they get sent to, were all designed and set up so that they could be loved, so that they could be nurtured to become the very unique beings that they are. That doesn't mean you're coddling these kids and telling them they're the center of the universe. Not at all. What you are doing, though, is you are saying that you are valuable, you are worthy of love and attention, and that we're going to come alongside you to try to help you live the life that is uniquely yours to live. And we're also going to teach you to try to live that same way with others. Right? It would be a dramatically different world, and I would dare say, it would be a world in which despair would not make much of an appearance.
Yeah, one of the threads of connection between the two that really came to mind is both when thinking about the way modernity orients one away from a prayer-filled life, and the similar features orient one away from a hope-filled one. And in both books, you look at the way both that the kind of modern subjects reformed and the kind of technological or utilitarian contraction of life. Yeah. And both of those features kind of sabotage the prayer-filled or hope-filled life. And one of the things I really appreciated about it is by orienting hope and prayer as kind of a mood of attention, it enables one to see both the thinness of life that we recognize, and that the embrace of hope or the prayer-filled life is something you actually have agency over, right? Like it's about the relationship of attention and time, features that show up in both of them. So I wonder if you can kind of unpack that as to how this connection between a hope-filled and prayer-filled life, and how to embrace it involves kind of intentional resistance to kind of a flattened subject and utilitarian contractions of our dreams.
Yeah, no, good question. I think speed and time are at the heart of so much of this. And, the more I think about this world and the troubles I think characterize it, there's no question in my mind that we do not make time to come into the presence of each other and our places, because we are only so quick as to move through them on our way somewhere else. We're not very clear on what that destination is, but it's going to be better, right? That's the promise that we are told over and over again. But I think what's so destructive about that is that the minute you think that it's about going through rather than going in, right? You decide already that you're not going to make time for the sanctity or the beauty or the vulnerability, the surprise of another to surface. Okay, and this again, we can just bring it back to a personal relationship. If I say, okay, Trip, we're going to be friends, but hey, 3 minutes every week, that's it, that's all you get. It's very clear that we're not going to get very far in a friendship, because to be a friend takes a lot of time. It takes time for me to listen to you, to learn about your struggles, your difficulties, your dreams, your hopes, all that kind of stuff. And if we're not making time for each other, we don't really know each other. And the acceleration of life, which has, many sort of side effects, right? Think about how historians refer to the post-World War II area as the Great Acceleration. It's not just the acceleration of what we do, but it's the acceleration of what we commodify and purchase and own now, right? We own so much, but we don't even know what we own, right? And this kind of way of speaking goes back a long, long way. We know in ancient philosophy that already talk there about how we don't care what things are, we just care what they cost, right? Something like that. But in any event, the point is that if we don't make time for each other, we're not going to be able to understand the depth of each other, the miracle and the mystery that each of us are. And by not understanding something about the mystery, the complexity of each other, we can't possibly put ourselves in a position to honor them in ways of engaging them respectfully, charitably, kindly, right, courteously, right? The many ways that we would show that we really love them and don't simply want to use them. And this is why, Sabbath makes an appearance in this book, because Sabbath, in my view, is not about checking out. It's not about, taking a break, which is, what a lot of people understand Sabbath to be. Sabbath is about sort of stilling or calming the restlessness that keeps us constantly on the move, going faster and faster. It's about learning that rest is about being in the presence of each other so that something like the love of God that is in them, at work in them, can emerge for you. And in doing so, also emerge in yourself, right? What would it do for us if we understood that the people we're engaging, the places that we are in, are actually embodiments of God's love, and that we ourselves are embodiments of God's love? How would that change the way we think about ourselves and our relationships to others? It would be huge, and it would have the effect of what God's first Shabbat was, which is God comes to rest in the presence of a creation beautifully made, right? How many people feel that they can do that every seventh day? Simply come to rest in the beauty of this world because it's made by God and is sustained by the love of God. In our time frame, right, our culture, that's virtually an impossibility because we're so committed to acceleration. We're so committed to more.
Yeah, one of the things that comes up there is the way the demands for time and attention in our modern context kind of have the deified demands of an idol that want us to sacrifice it, and yet in the kind of modern moral imaginary they're valorized, where there's this like part of the dehumanizing experience of an increasing number of people comes from the scarcity of time and attention because of the demands. And one of the things I really appreciate is that you've lifted up both how the scarcity of time and attention comes from demands, for some of us that we've internalized them, right? Like we don't need Foucault's panopticon anymore because we've managed to internalize the demands of the market. And then others, those whose material reality is one where just meeting their basic needs isn't there. They might have 3 jobs and this kind of thing, and then are looking at you going, oh, well, what do you mean savoring time and attention? This Sabbath stuff, that's for the upper middle class and above, Norman.
It's so bourgeois. Come on.
Yeah, and that dynamic's there, and yet in the priestly creation story, Sabbath is the crescendo. Right, like Sabbath is the crescendo of creation. This is when we're doing it as intended, and those Sabbath demands are things that are extended to the natural world. They're extended to forgiveness of debt and the redistribution of land. Like it's hard to look at the wisdom of Israel and its witness to the Creator and not recognize that something is being seized by another ultimate or claim of ultimacy, when both those who have the drive to keep their place in a more successful element of the market and those who are just trying to have their own humanity within it, they share this kind of like double bind of their time and attention being seized and ripped from them.
Yep. No, really good observation, Trip. And I think 2 things I would say. Right. On the one hand, we can talk about this in terms of solicitation overload. Right. Everybody wants a piece of us, and that happens in multiple registers. Right. On the one hand, if you are an employee in some institution, the institution has unceasing demands that they can put upon you. There are professional demands that can be upon you because we're all terrified of being slackers, or being perceived to be slackers. And when you think about how our economy has become one that is driven by this ruthless, utterly ruthless pursuit of not just profit, but enormous profit. It ain't enough to make a 2% return on your investment. We want to have a 36 or a 75 or 160% return on investment, right? I just read recently that BP oil and gas, they've just decided that they're going to give up on their sustainable energy goals because the return on investment was only 35%, right? Exxon's return on investment was 180%. And so BP said, hey, 30%, 35% ain't enough. We're going to go for 180. But to do that, we're going to ramp up oil and gas production. Forget about sustainable energy, right? This is an indication of how ridiculous, right, we've become in our expectations. And what this imposes upon us is just a huge weight in which everybody is feeling. Everybody wants to maximize the money that they can draw out of engaging with us, right? So there's that solicitation overload dimension to us, which I think is a really, really deep kind of problem. And now I forgot what the second one was going to be. But I think that we have to be honest. Oh, here it is. The second one is that when we're talking about trying to come into the presence of each other, it's really crucial that we not think this is all an individual pursuit, right? That's the neoliberal framing, which is doing so much damage, because if we succeed, it's all because of our prowess, our ability, or whatever. And if we fail, it's all our own fault. And we have to recognize that the neoliberal economic political order that we're in has reduced so many people to being individuals struggling on their own. And so your example of the person working 3 jobs, and I go to them and say, hey, practice the Sabbath. Are you kidding me? This is where a community becomes so important. Because if we understand the kind of reality that we're talking about, right? Hope happens in community. It's not a heroic pursuit that you have on your own. Right? You need a community to come alongside you to help you see, first of all, how you're in conditions that are degrading you, but then how they can assist you so that the degradation, right, is minimized or even addressed completely, so that you're not trying to do this on your own, but you're doing it with other people who care enough about you that they can sense where your struggles are, but also where your gifts are, and they can help you mobilize both.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. We haven't mentioned the title. You've mentioned faith and hope's relationship, but not the love. And the braided dance is one in which you're kind of bringing being in hope. You even say it's like being in love.
Yes.
So I'd love for you to kind of unpack, because it's not obviously it's the title for some reason. But kind of help us understand how that nature of hope is, being in hope is similar to like being in love.
Yeah. So the way I came to this is I go around and talk to a lot of different kinds of groups, and often I'm talking about things that are pretty hard to deal with, right? They're depressing, climate change, inequality, polarization, whatever. And so I would always get this question, what gives you hope? And I was getting pretty tired of that question. And I started to say, I don't want to answer that question. I want to answer a different one, which is, what do I love? And then put it to you, what do you love? And I think that's a better way to frame what we're trying to get at when we ask the question, what gives you hope? Because love is the power, first of all, I believe, that creates, sustains, and heals the world. And we could get into a long discussion about why we might believe that. Most basically, it's because people, places, creatures respond to love. Okay? So love is absolutely fundamental. And so for us to live a hopeful way of being, we need to participate in that love. And I call that participation a braided dance. Because it's, first of all, it's a dance because it's improvisational, right? We have to learn who we're dancing with. And that means that we have to spend time learning about each other, learning about what's possible, what's not possible, where, given a little bit of help, we could really accelerate and do something beautiful, or we really got to slow down because we need to sort of come up with a way of navigating a difficulty or whatever, right? So it's a dance in that sense, but it's braided. Because it's not just that I have a partner for a while and we walk our own way. No, we're implicated in the lives of each other. And a braided rope, as you will know, you can take the strands apart, but the strands always carry the shape of the braid in them. Because when we're in relationship with each other, we're not like links in a chain. Okay? We're woven together. We're deeply entangled with each other. And that's an indication of not just our need of each other in some sort of voluntary or episodic way. It's our need for each other at the most intimate and visceral level, right? We're talking about each other's nurture, each other's sustenance, each other's support, each other's inspiration. And so this becomes a way of trying to communicate how any future that's going to be one that is inspiring us to get off the couch and participate is going to be a future in which love's braided dance is happening all over the place, because we're seeing people who are committed to each other, committed to their communities, working with them to heal them, to make them more beautiful, so forth.
Yeah. You spend some time picking up on the phrase in Ecclesiastes, joining with the living.
Yeah.
And I think it resonates there with that notion of, if you unbraid a rope, it still has the form of its relations.
Right.
It also has less strength, right, when unbraided. And so I wonder, like, of all these different texts that you could have picked up from the biblical witness to help bring into this conversation where the theological virtue of hope is being offered in a wider frame, what's being captured in the phrase joining with the living that you think is kind of worth really the reader beholding, in a sense?
Yeah. Well, I think partly I wanted to have Ecclesiastes 9, right, as the opening quote, because Ecclesiastes is one of the more honest books in the Bible. It's not a cheery
I don't know. You're
book.
A theology professor at school. You aren't supposed to have dishonest Bible texts.
I suppose you're right.
It's bad for your job employment.
Yeah, but I mean, think about it. I mean, if you read Ecclesiastes, it's downright depressing.
You don't have to cross your fingers in it.
I know. You just know that this is a person who looks life in the face and says, man, it's rough. out there. And so for this line to emerge in that text is an indication that this is not just wishful thinking. So that's probably one of the main reasons that I wanted to lift that text up, because if you decide that you're going to go read Ecclesiastes now, you're going to say, wow, this is rough. But that's okay, because life is rough, and we know that. And so to have a text that is speaking so honestly to us is really, really important. And so whatever it says about hope, we got to take seriously, right? That was sort of the starting assumption.
Which, by the way, for people listening, the whole verse is whoever is joined with all the living has hope.
Yeah. So the other thing that I would pick up on that is that, as I was trying to figure out how to structure the book, what I discovered over and over again is that in the stories I tell, there's often a gesture of a hand reaching out to another hand, right? That there is this literal joining of two beings to each other that is electrifying, that is inspiring, that is motivating, that is actually the vehicle by which something good can happen. Not always easy, but certainly something good happens. And so, in the opening story about Carmine reaching into the water to pull out this drowning Eritrean refugee, right? His description of reaching out and having hand clasp hand, how that was utterly transformative to him. Or the experience of Nelson Mandela reaching out to de Klerk and in the midst of real anger and a history of struggle, still reaching out the hand, right? These kinds of gestures that appear throughout the book of hand to hand, this joining issue became so clear to me as the visual image of what a hopeful life looks like. If we can't join hands, even with people who we understand to be difficult, and crucially, even the people we understand to have wronged ourselves, we're in trouble, because, as you know, joining with others is not an easy or simple thing, which is why, for me, it was important that not just one, but 2 chapters in the book are about forgiveness.
Yeah. My next question was about the role of forgiveness, and I'm interested in not just forgiveness getting 2 chapters, but how this larger kind of conversation we've had and the reflection you've had about our contemporary cultural context. Are there ways in which the kind of modern form of life has drained the potential for forgiveness increasingly out of it, that makes, as a topic, worth spending a kind of sustained meditation in 2 chapters on it?
Yeah, I think so. I think, if you think about how the neoliberal framing of our lives, not just our thinking, but our very living, it puts us in a position where any effort we have that wants to reach out to another is fraught with much, much more vulnerability, because you're doing it by yourself. You don't have the help or assistance of another to help broker your reaching out to another to ask for forgiveness. It's sort of like, the parallel would be hospitality, right? Hospitality is a big theme within religious traditions, but it becomes much, much more precarious in a modern context, where you're just the lone individual who's now going to show hospitality to the stranger, because it's just you and the stranger, and there's all kinds of dangers involved in that. It's the same with trying to do forgiveness with another person. If it's just you 2 people, there's a lot more danger involved in it, because you don't have anyone helping mediate that encounter. Because I can be really mistaken about what I think I understand about the cause of the need for forgiveness even. And because I'm going at this by myself, I'm completely vulnerable to what the person I'm engaging with will say. So here too, a communal dimension, I think, becomes really important, where we can help each other figure out, how do we understand the wrong that's been done? How do we articulate the wrong? And now, having articulated the wrong, what steps can we possibly take, right? And for all of that, I would say we need discernment and help from other people. And this is not a simple thing, obviously, when you're in a neoliberal context and you're basically stuck by yourself. But if you can have a community of people that'll help you discern, how have I wronged this person, or how have I wronged this community, or how have I wronged this place, right? I mean, I talk about forgiveness from the land even, right? That becomes a different kind of activity when you're not going at it just by your very, very self, but you've had the experience and you have the insight that comes from being in conversation and relationship with others. Because as we know, we can fool ourselves very, very easily about either our own righteousness or not. We can fool ourselves about our own wrongdoing, I would say too. But I also mentioned just briefly that, if you think here about the Freudian principle, which is that people have real difficulty dealing with a history, a past that is messy and full of wrongdoing. So we're constantly trying to tidy up our memories so that we can appear better than we actually are. And that happens personally and culturally, I would say. And we're seeing it right now, right? America is not going to deal with its racist or its genocidal past, because that gives us a picture of America, which we don't want to have to deal with. But the result of not dealing with it is that we can't ever move in a better direction, because the afterlives of genocide and slavery and oppression, they just continue. And I think the same thing happens in our personal lives. If we're not trying to figure out how the history of both right doing and wrongdoing are working themselves out in us, we're not going to be in a very good position to go to another and say, I need to confess about wrongdoing here, and I need to work with you now to figure out how we can do things better so that we can still be together in relationship. And just a quick caveat, in some instances, it's not advisable to try to be together.
Yeah. You mentioned how the image of hand to hand shows up repeatedly in the book, and another element that does is the task of listening, be it in the big situations, right? Which Mandela's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all the way down to the role of listening, even within our most intimate relationships, to the way the way we frame our relationship to the natural world is one where we don't listen. We've rendered it a natural resource, and these kinds of things. How do you see the relationship of those who cultivate the ability to listen rather than the demand of being heard all the time, connecting to individuals being able to have a hopeful orientation despite the possibility of catastrophe?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think listening is a lot more complicated than we often make it out to be, because I think we confuse hearing and listening, and they're not the same thing. I can hear you, but the minute I'm hearing you, I'm already trying to anticipate how I'm going to respond to you, because that's what hearing and being in an interview suggests is important to do. But if I was deeply listening, right, maybe something you would say would actually stop me dead in my tracks, and I've got nothing to say because you've hit something deep inside of me. And that's a different kind of activity, which, first of all, takes a lot of time. And it means that you're not constantly positioning yourself so as to be able to respond in a way that will sort of communicate my advantage over you, right? And this happens in academic circles all the time. We're hearing each other, but we're hearing each other with the aim of being to one-upmanship or one-womanship or whatever the word is in a situation like this. Because
well, we could definitely turn a question after our friend's very thoughtful and composed paper into a 6-minute excursus on our current writing project. It's really
exactly
impressive.
Right. Exactly. And so, and it reflects a kind of impatience with the world. I would say it also reflects a kind of dissatisfaction with the world, and it certainly reflects a profound insecurity within ourselves, where we are feeling a need to constantly assert ourselves so as to show that we matter, right? I'm smarter than you. I'm more powerful than you. I'm richer than you, or whatever. I mean, there's just so many ways that this can happen. And I think what listening is doing is it's first of all helping us appreciate that if we believed that we were in a world that is beloved by God, that if we believed we are in a world in which we could trust God to provide for our needs, would we have to be so anxious, so aggressive in our relationship to the world, right? And I would say that the listening posture disarms the aggressive posture. Because when I'm listening to someone deeply, I'm prepared to be instructed. I'm prepared to be nurtured by another. And I think so much of what we do is a resistance in the face of that, because we have this seemingly incessant need to establish our standing amongst each other. And that's obviously getting us into a lot of trouble.
Yeah. It's been a while since I read your prayer book, but I feel like there's a connection here, at least within the way I talked about it, right, after reading it and like using it to help frame introduction to prayer for congregants. The role of listening really becomes a way of undermining the demand for control, and framing a kind of prayerful or hopeful responsibility to the other. And so one of the things I think that shrinks our potential for hope is when we think that our relationship to other things, like being responsible for them, is the mode of engagement, where now the agency of the other or collectives is something we are fully responsible for. Then it sets us up to want to control them, as opposed to being responsible to them. In order to be responsible to anyone, like even our kids, right, learning to listen well, like to learn them in their particularities, to be responsible to our ecosystem. We actually have to get to know it and learn it. To be responsible to those who have been harmed because of our inherited privilege actually requires listening and understanding. And there's this kind of release that happens when you realize that like hope and faith are born when the boundary between what we're responsible for, our own attention, what we say, what we do, how we orient our own selves, and how we are responsible to others. And in order to even understand what responsibility to the other could look like, requires listening. And it's so uncomfortable in a context where the other comes already rendered in a flat, dismissible, or valorizing narrative. But where and this is increasingly intensified, right, by the way algorithms mediate our relationships. So to me, there's this other resonance between thinking about the prayerful life and the hopeful one is coming to one, cherish your own responsibility for yourself, but then to celebrate the dignity of the other, and then hear their own experience, encounter challenges, so we can be responsible to them. And like you mentioned earlier, that the text isn't replete with theological language, but you point first to the incarnation, right? Like the incarnation is precisely what it would look like for God to listen and to know in the most intimate of ways, even death on a cross.
No, that's all good. And I think, as a way to sort of respond to what you've just said, I remember, I mentioned Kyle White, this friend of mine who's an indigenous philosopher, is the one who says that we have to worry about hope talk because it creates the ultimate bystander effect. That's where I got that from. But he came to Duke a while back and he gave a talk, and he said something that was just so arresting and sort of framework transforming when he said the climate crisis is not a crisis of technology, right? Which is where we're mostly thinking, how are we going to develop a new energy grid? That's the big question, right? How are we going to, learn to terraform Mars or some other ridiculous idea like that? But he said the climate crisis is a crisis of consent. And that just blew us away, because he said, if you think about how the problem with STEM approaches to climate change is that we're constantly looking for the new technocratic, techno-scientific solution that will accelerate our ability to address the problems we've created with the previous technocratic solution. and we just keep ratcheting up the solutions that exacerbate, right, the problems that we face. He said, what if we started by asking for consent of the communities that we are going to try to enact our technological solution? Or ask the land, right? How do you think about our desire to enact this technocratic solution? And he says, if we did that, we would have a radically different way of understanding our crisis moment, but also addressing it. And we would, first of all, start by slowing down and learning to listen to the stories that we all tell, that the land tells, about how past engagement has brought us to this path of degradation. And that, I think, that was a really transformative way of framing what the climate crisis is. And I think it's a good way to also ask all kinds of questions about how are we treating young people? How are we treating the elderly? How are we treating neighborhoods? Right? How are we thinking about built environments? Right? All these questions get framed in new ways when you're starting to look at it through the lens of consent.
Yeah. Oh, that's extremely helpful. I read your book right after I read this one, Byung-Chul Han's new book, The Spirit of Hope.
So I've heard about that book. I haven't read it yet.
It's spectacular, and y'all read in the Braided dance of Norman and Han. Really exciting. And what's fascinating is both within his work, this is a more kind of intentional turn as to kind of what you do about the material situation, because so often he's been descriptive. And in the work, he turns explicitly to theological resources.
Really?
Like Moltmann and Ernst Bloch's relationship, the kind of theodrama series. Like it's fascinating, and he's doing it as a form of critique to kind of Heidegger and that tradition that thought that the orientation of human subjectivity is primarily structured on kind of existential fear, the function of death and negation. And he wants to kind of challenge that to go like this is a world without hope is one that has taken that as an ontological given. It's a beautiful text, and reading them back to forth just made me kind of want y'all to hang out, and where I could like be a fly on the wall. But one of the elements in it that we haven't talked about in your book that he talks about is the hopelessness of the world is intimately connected to the thinning of solidarity, and that to learn to speak and act as a we again is kind of the ground in which hope emerges, because it generates a kind of solidarity that the market, our kind of technological selves, and a bunch of other things we've kind of generated don't do. Along with one of the other features is that it enables a response to the crisis of narration in the modern world. Like and a world without narratives is one where it's hard to acknowledge simultaneously the possible catastrophe we face, the uncertainty of the future, and something new to be born, to kind of attend to or awaken to possibilities that the past and the givens don't generate. And in it, the mode of hope he calls contemplative listening. And you see how I read this book right after I read your book, and I'm just like, this is why somebody's supposed to give a grant for y'all to hang out at Duke where I can come over, because
hey, you write that for me, man. I'll be there,
because I'm just sitting there going like, this is so beautiful. And he ends on a reflection that faith, hope, and love are bound together, and any without the other ultimately leaves us in a kind of soulful emaciation. And so,
wow.
I wonder what you think about this, that element of solidarity, as someone who works both in a student environment, works with across different disciplines, are working with faith leaders and community faith-inspired activists and such. when you think about the nature of hope, what role does that kind of the cultivation of the we, of a kind of deep solidarity, or embracing the possibility of shared narratives again? What role do you see that playing?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm totally agreeing with what you're talking about here, and I think what I would say is the Love's Braided dance is sort of my equivalent of the language of solidarity. I didn't use the language of solidarity very much because it immediately has a register that takes you in a sort of political activist mode, and there's potential good reason for all of that, no question. But I speak specifically about how the skills of togetherness have been eroded by modern cultural and economic forms. And so for me, the cultivation of skills of togetherness are absolutely central, and solidarity becomes one of the ways in which that togetherness is being realized for all sorts of people. So absolutely, I agree with what he's talking about. And I think also this narratival dimension is something that I would resonate with at the same time, because we have so gotten used to thinking of the story of our lives as the story of individuals who are either super successful or super failures. Very heroic conception. And it's, reflected not just in the neoliberal time that we're in, but it's also reflected in a lot of literature, right? The quest of the hero or something of that sort. And I want to say that that's just not true to who we are as people, right? That the lives that we live are always in the we form rather than the I form. And I argue, in fact, not so much in this book, but in This Sacred Life, that if you want to really make sense of what a human being is you have to talk about us in the middle voice. It's always others speaking through me while I'm speaking, because it's just false to assume that I could speak out of my own self or that I could live out of my own self. It's impossible. We can't do that. And so we have to think about what are the basic anthropological framings that we give to help us make sense of who we are, but also who we are in relationship to others. And if you understand that we are always a we, never an I, that's a game changer for how we're going to address a lot of the questions that we're trying to address.
Yeah. One of my favorite Whitehead lines is "All things grow together," and I find that oftentimes if I take the aphorism as a question, it helps me kind of reorient to what you've described as kind of like this hope-filled orientation or a kind of prayer-filled life, and because there's a kind of mirage of isolation that is so rampant in our modern culture that to ask a question of importance normally gets framed where you're already alone, and the limits of the answers are the limits of yourself. And it's like, what theologically, it's like, well, what's the Christian life if the Paraclete never came alongside? And you're like, it's just not Christian. But and yet so many times we kind of frame it that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And this is, I think, one of the questions that is really in the minds of a lot of people when you think about how the attraction of something like transhumanism, and I think the attraction of AI, is that it promises us a vision of a human life that is still highly individual, but now ramped up in terms of its power, so that any of the previous finitude or fallibility that used to characterize our lives can now be overcome, because we're going to have, machines that are super intelligent, that have computational power that vastly exceeds us. And the folks who work in this area tell us what we're looking at is a future of AI in which the capacities, the powers so exceed anything that we could possibly imagine, we probably aren't human anymore. At which point I want to say, well, what was the point then? If the point was to make human life better, but to do that we have to leave the human behind, what was the point? It's kind of a ridiculous enterprise when you think more carefully about it. But right, we're in this age of unthinking, I would say, and that's a problem.
Oh yeah. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because I have a few other things. But what that actually made me think of, and this is more, I guess, confessional, that I spend way too much time reading things about Middle Earth, but Thorin's deep insight at the end of The Hobbit, like as he's dying and talking to Bilbo, is this recognition that this desire for a home turned in, to reclaim their home, turned into a desire where he got seized by the act of possession of power, and it generates this whole war and all these other kinds of things. And as he's dying, he says to Bilbo, like, "Farewell, Master Burglar. Go back to your books and your armchair. Plant your trees. Watch them grow. If more people valued home above gold, this world would be a merrier place." And then it's one of my favorite books to read to kids, and in hopes that they'll eventually want to read the Silmarillion. But also, it's one of these places where the narrative itself kind of it sets aside the whole logic that drove the plot. That ultimately there is a kind of value in how Bilbo and the Hobbit saw the Shire and their home that even his own desire for this home didn't have. And and the idea that you would have a merrier place, right, as opposed to a merrier life, is just one of the beautiful things about the Hobbits throughout all of it. That their attachment isn't to themselves, but to their home and the community and the land, and such. And I often think that so much of the church and its anxiety about the world and its fears about the future and all these kinds of things it needs someone to give that kind of deathbed confession again. And I know that's a lot how Wendell Berry has functioned for you.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And if you bring it back to what I was saying earlier about how what we have is a proliferation of data and a proliferation of computational power, but we don't even have real knowledge, let alone wisdom, right? The question about how do we make for a merrier place, that is the question of wisdom. And I think right now we're in a time when so many people are saying the framing about what a good life is totally off. In fact, it's not just off, it's deeply destructive. And they're wondering, what is the point? What are we trying to do with all of our accomplishments, with all of our commodification and accumulation of things? What is the point of all of that? And so there's a real, I think, readiness to bring back fundamental questions about what matters. What's the significance of, get this, being a multi-billionaire? I mean, we now use that language as if we all knew what that meant. That's ridiculous for someone to have $1 billion. But we're now in this race to have hundreds of billions of dollars, and we're even talking about who's going to be the first trillionaire. That is absolutely ridiculous. It's a failure of the greatest moral capacity that you can imagine, that we would think, that's a really cool idea.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's there was a dude once that said you could serve God or mammon, and it was the only binary he ever had. And I don't know what that was about. So when you're addressing these kind of conversations with students or in faith communities where we think about our vocation, have you found any particular questions that help people kind of reorient the way they see themselves in the world, to see the potential for hope embracing form of life in the present?
Yeah, I think, there's different ways to go about this depending on who you're with and what the context of the conversation is. But, one of the things I try to get people to do is to sort of do some personal reflection about when have they known happiness and satisfaction. That's just a basic starting point. When have you known it? And for a lot of people, it's a struggle. And then I say, okay, if you can identify what has been that time or encounter or relationship of satisfaction, what makes it go awry? Or what do you need to nurture it, to support it, to extend it? And that, I think, becomes an opening then into a whole host of other questions like, what are the factors, social, economic, individual, whatever, that are preventing you from living in that way of being more regularly? And it doesn't take long for people to realize how the sources of their dissatisfaction and their unhappiness can be identified. And the reason you need to start with them identifying their own source of satisfaction and happiness is because the temptation is for them to say, oh, here comes it's another moralizer who's come to beat us over the head with the fact that we're spending too much time on Facebook or TikTok or whatever. What you want to do is you want to help people come to the realization themselves about what is particular to their own situation. Because everybody's dealing with their own issues, right? And so it's important that we help people to the ways of self-discovery rather than simply sort of prescriptive preaching at them.
All right, so the last thing I think that might be helpful for those that or one, maybe you could make explicit some of the connections from our conversation in the book to the way you would understand hope theologically, and for those that are stewards of the Christian tradition, what are the resources within it that we might pass over or not utilize in trying to articulate the faith that generates this kind of potential for hope, while being honest about the crises and challenges we face?
Yeah, I mean, I think one place that I would start right off is have people pay attention to what Jesus is doing in his ministerial context and go deeply into it, right? Not just read the story and say, oh, there was a miracle going on here. Isn't that pretty cool? But to actually look at, well, let's set the scene here and let's try to figure out what are the parallels. And then once we can start to do that, we can see, first of all, how Jesus is attentive to another, how he's able to see in another something like the love of God, which is currently being frustrated or denied, which is preventing them from living the life that God wants for them. And then to just see over and over again that what Jesus desires in his relationships with people is that they be happy. Right? Think about it. Jesus wants people to be happy. That's why he feeds them. That's why he heals them. That's why he befriends them. And I don't mean happiness in some silly sort of romantic, sentimental way. I mean deeply understanding of themselves as beloved and as members of a community that loves them, all of which inspired by the love of God that sustains them daily. Right? I think that would become a way of saying, we don't have fancy teachings. We just have to learn how do we participate in a way that it opens up the world to us as a place where it is, first of all, perceived to be lovely because it's loved by God, and love-worthy. And if we give our love to a place, to another, to a community, we will be doing the very best that could possibly be done by any of us. It's really very, very simple, but it's very, very hard. Because the minute you say, what does it take for us to love each other in the kinds of ways that Jesus is showing, we're going to discover pretty quickly that the structures of our everyday life mitigate against that, because it's all about speed, it's all about professionalization, it's all about maximization, optimization, all these things that prevent us from really being in the presence of each other in the way that Jesus was present to others.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking. Is there something I missed or, I should have made sure we talk about?
Oh, man, we can talk for hours. This has been good. This has been a lot of fun, Trip.
Oh, no, I absolutely enjoyed your book, and I'm very excited that we got to talk about it, and that everyone listening will feel the lure to go read it yourself.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show, Trip.